This is one of the most famous racing paintings ever made, by one of the greatest painters who ever lived, and every single horse in it is doing something no horse has ever done. Look at how they run. Front legs stretched straight out ahead, back legs flung straight out behind, bellies almost skimming the grass, all four hooves in the air at once. Flying, reaching, stretched to full length like a greyhound at a sprint. It's beautiful. It's thrilling. It feels like pure speed, and it is completely, physically impossible. No galloping horse has ever, in the history of horses, put its legs in that position. Not once. Théodore Géricault painted this in 1821, and he wasn't a fool or an amateur. He was obsessed with horses. He rode, he studied them. He died from injuries after falling off one. If anyone should have got a horse right, it was him. And he got it wrong. So did Stubbs. So did Leonardo. So did the ancient Greeks, the Chinese, the Persians, the Egyptians. For more than 3,000 years, in every civilization that ever painted a running horse, the greatest artists on earth drew the gallop wrong. The same wrong, the identical, impossible pose. And not one of them ever caught the mistake. Stop and let the scale of that land, because there is nothing else in the history of human knowledge quite like it. We're not talking about an obscure error in a difficult field known only to specialists. We're talking about the most common large animal in human civilization, doing the most ordinary thing it does, running, depicted wrongly by everyone, everywhere, for longer than we've had written history in some places. Cultures that got astronomy right, that built the pyramids, that calculated the movements of the planets, that produced Leonardo and the Parthenon. All of them, without exception, drew a running horse in a way that no running horse has ever moved. It is possibly the longest-lived, most widespread single error in the entire record of human observation. And it survived not in spite of everyone looking, but because of how everyone looked. It took a camera, a murderer, and a millionaire's bet to finally freeze a horse in mid-stride and show the entire history of art that it had been lying for 3 millennia. This is that story. And it's really a story about the limits of the human eye, and what happened the day a machine outran it. But I want to be fair to Géricault and everyone like him before we go on, because the word wrong is doing a lot of work here, and it isn't quite fair yet. These weren't careless painters. They were, many of them, the most careful observers who have ever lived. People who could capture the exact fall of light on a fold of silk, the precise weight of a hand, the individual character of a face. They looked harder at the world than almost anyone, and they still got the horse's legs wrong, every time, for 30 centuries. That combination, supreme skill, total attention, and universal, unbroken failure at one specific thing, is the puzzle at the heart of this whole story. It tells you the failure can't have been about talent, or effort, or care. Something else was in the way. Something they couldn't see past no matter how gifted they were. And figuring out what that something was tells you something profound about how seeing actually works. To understand why this took so long, you have to understand exactly what the human eye can and can't do, because that's the real subject here. A galloping horse completes a full stride, all 4 legs cycling through their entire sequence in under half a second. The legs move faster than that. Individual hooves snap through positions in a few hundredths of a second, and the human eye simply cannot freeze that. Your visual system blurs anything moving that fast into a smear. You can watch a horse gallop past you 1,000 times from a foot away with perfect eyesight and total attention, and you will never once see the true position of its legs at any given instant. The information is there in front of you. Your eyes are not fast enough to catch it. This is not a failure of skill. It's a hardware limit of being human, and it's worth understanding why, because it's not that your eye is bad. It's that your eye evolved for a completely different job. Human vision is built to track objects smoothly and to fuse rapid motion into continuous, useful information. To see that a horse is coming toward you and roughly how fast, not to freeze the precise geometry of its ankles. Evolution never had any reason to give us thousandth of a second shutter speed. Nothing in our survival depended on knowing the exact leg position of a running animal at one frozen instant. So our brains do something clever, and, for this purpose, ruinous. They take the blur of fast motion and smooth it into an impression of grace and flow, throwing away the individual positions entirely. You don't see the frames. You see the movie your brain assembles from frames it never actually caught. Which means that when a painter tried to draw the truth of a galloping horse, they weren't even working from bad data. They were working from data their own brain had already deleted and replaced with a summary. So what did painters do, faced with emotion they couldn't actually see? They guessed, and they all made the same guess. Look at George Stubbs, the single greatest painter of horses who ever lived. A man so serious about equine anatomy that he spent years dissecting dead horses, peeling them layer by layer, and published a book of engravings, The Anatomy of the Horse, that surgeons and artists used for a century. Nobody in history knew the inside of a horse better than Stubbs, and when he painted one galloping, he painted the same impossible flying stretch as everyone else. The greatest anatomist got the motion wrong, because anatomy is about a still body, and no amount of knowing the bones tells you what they do in 1/100th of a second. Where did the wrong pose even come from? The best guess is that painters borrowed it from the one fast animal they could sort of see. The dog. A running dog, a greyhound or a hound, really does extend front and back at full stretch because a dog's flexible spine lets it reach that way. Painters watched dogs run, couldn't see what horses actually did, and assumed a horse must do the same thing, only bigger. They transplanted the dog's gallop onto the horse. And because it looked fast, because it read as speed, because nobody could prove it wrong, it stuck for thousands of years. And once a convention like that takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to break from the inside, for a reason that has nothing to do with observation. Painters learn from other painters. An apprentice learns to draw a galloping horse by copying his master's galloping horse, who copied his master's all the way back. The flying gallop wasn't re-derived from life by each generation. It was inherited, handed down, a piece of visual grammar so established that it stopped being a claim about horses and became simply how you draw a fast horse, the way a child draws a sun as a circle with lines coming off it. Nobody checks it against reality because it's not really about reality anymore. It's a symbol everyone agrees on. And here's the trap. Even if some sharp-eyed painter had somehow glimpsed the truth and painted a horse with its legs bunched under its belly, it would have looked wrong to everyone, including him. It would have looked like a mistake, because it didn't match the convention. The lie was self-reinforcing. Getting it right would have looked like getting it wrong. So the whole civilization of horse painters was locked, for millennia, into a pose that felt correct, precisely because everyone else was doing it too. And here is the part that should genuinely astonish you. This exact wrong pose appears independently all over the ancient world. The flying gallop turns up in Bronze Age art of the Aegean, in ancient Chinese horse imagery, in Persian and Near Eastern work, across cultures that had no contact with each other and no way of copying one another's mistake. They all arrived at the same impossible horse separately, because they were all up against the same wall, the same too fast motion, the same too slow eye, and they all reached for the same intuitive solution: stretch it out, make it look like speed. Interestingly, there's one partial exception. The ancient Greeks, in some of their work, painted a more restrained pose, closer to a canter, legs gathered rather than flung. That happens to correspond to one real phase of a horse's stride. So it's not that every single culture got every horse wrong every time, but the dramatic, running, all four legs, extended flying gallop, the pose everyone reached for to show real speed, that one was universal and universally impossible. For 30 centuries, the fastest, most exciting version of a horse in art was a pose no horse could strike. Think about what that means. This isn't one artist's error. It's not even one culture's error. It's a limit of human perception, made visible, repeated across the entire span of recorded art, by everyone, forever. Until, quite suddenly, in the space of a single afternoon in California, it ended. And it's worth pausing on how strange it is that nobody caught it for so long. Because it's not as if horses were rare or exotic. For almost all of this history, the horse was the single most important animal in human life. You went to war on a horse. You farmed with horses, traveled by horse, hauled everything that needed hauling with horses. Armies, empires, economies ran on horsepower. Literally. Millions of people spent their entire lives around horses, watched them run every day, bred them, raced them, loved them, depended on them for survival. If sheer familiarity could have solved this, it would have been solved 10,000 times over. It wasn't. The most watched animal in human history had a secret in its stride that all that watching could never uncover, because the secret was hidden not in the horse, but in the gap between the horse and the human eye. Ubiquity didn't help. You cannot stare your way past the frame rate of your own retina. In 1872, a railroad millionaire named Leland Stanford, former governor of California, founder of the university, and a fanatical horse breeder, wanted to settle a question that had nagged horsemen forever. When a horse gallops, is there a moment when all four hooves leave the ground at once? Riders suspected it. Nobody could prove it because, again, the motion was too fast for the eye. Stanford hired a photographer named Eadweard Muybridge, a brilliant, eccentric, difficult man who, a few years earlier, had shot and killed his wife's lover, stood trial for murder, and been acquitted by a jury that decided the killing was justifiable. This is the man who was about to correct 3,000 years of art. It took him years and several false starts, but on the 19th of June, 1878, at Stanford's farm in Palo Alto, he finally did it. The technical problem he had to solve was enormous, and it's why nobody had done this before. Early photography needed long exposures, seconds, sometimes minutes, during which anything moving turned to a ghost or vanished entirely. To freeze a horse's leg, Muybridge needed an exposure of around 1,000th of a second, and he had to build the equipment to do it more or less from scratch: faster shutters, more sensitive plates, a brilliant white backdrop to maximize contrast, and a system to fire the cameras automatically at exactly the right instance, because no human hand could press a shutter fast enough or precisely enough. His solution, the threads stretched across the track, each tied to a shutter, the horse triggering its own portrait as it ran, was genuinely ingenious. The horse photographed itself 12 times, or 24, in the space of a single stride. He lined up the cameras along the edge of the track. He stretched the threads across the horse's path. As the mare, Sally Gardner, galloped past, she broke each thread in turn, and each broken thread fired a camera. For the first time in history, a machine captured a horse's stride in a sequence of frozen instants, each one lasting a fraction of 1,000th of a second, far faster than any human eye could ever resolve. And he developed the plates right there, in front of a crowd of journalists, so nobody could claim it was a trick. The evidence was made, checked, and published on the spot. The photograph settled Stanford's question instantly. Yes, there is a moment when all four hooves are off the ground. The horse really does fly, but, and this is the twist that makes the whole story worth telling, it does not fly the way every painter for 3,000 years had drawn it. In the flying gallop paintings, the horse is airborne with its legs stretched to full extension, front reaching forward, back reaching behind. Muybridge's photographs showed the truth. The horse is indeed airborne. But at that exact moment, its legs are gathered, bunched, folded up underneath its body, collected under the belly, not flung out at the ends. The one instant a horse is fully off the ground is the instant it looks least like the dramatic stretched pose, and most like it's tucked into a ball in mid-air. Everybody was right that horses fly. Everybody was wrong about what flying looks like. The real pose is stranger, more compact, less graceful, and no one had ever imagined it because no one had ever been able to see it. And there's a lovely, almost eerie footnote to this. When scholars went back and looked hard at the entire history of art with Muybridge's truth in hand, they found that this correct, bunched, legs under the body pose, the real suspension phase, does show up a tiny handful of times in scattered places across thousands of years. There's a horse in a cave painting in Spain, made something like 17,000 years ago, that appears to catch it. There are a few Chinese bronze ornaments from over 2,000 years ago that seem to get it right. A stray Renaissance manuscript here and there. Almost certainly these weren't scientific triumphs. They were lucky guesses, or unusually sharp individual observations that happened to land on the truth and were then ignored because they didn't match the convention everyone else agreed on. The right answer surfaced a few times across all of human history, and every time the culture around it shrugged and went back to the beautiful lie. The truth wasn't just unseen. When it did briefly appear, it was overruled, and the photographs revealed something else, something that unsettled artists even more than the airborne pose. Horses, frozen mid-stride, look awkward, ungainly, almost ugly. In the real sequence of a gallop, there are instances where the legs are at strange, gawky, half-folded angles. Nothing like the smooth, flowing, elegant creature everyone believed they were watching. The grace of a galloping horse, it turned out, was partly an illusion manufactured by the human eye's inability to see it clearly. Blur the awful in-between positions together, and your brain hands you elegance. Freeze them, and you get a series of poses no artist would ever have chosen, because they look wrong even though they're right. This is the deep irony at the center of the story. For 3,000 years, painters drew a horse that was anatomically impossible, but felt true. The flying gallop breeds as speed and grace. It satisfies the eye. It looks the way galloping feels. Muybridge drew a horse that was anatomically perfect, but felt wrong. The real poses looked stiff, mechanical, ungainly, frozen. The lie was beautiful. The truth was awkward, and artists suddenly had to decide which one they wanted. And that choice turned out to be genuinely painful, because it exposed something nobody wanted to admit, that beauty and accuracy are not the same thing, and sometimes they're enemies. The whole confident story of Western art, that painters were on a long, noble march towards showing the world as it truly is, quietly assumed that the true version would also be the beautiful one, that reality, correctly seen, would turn out to be gorgeous. The horse broke that assumption. Here was a case where the accurate answer was uglier than the invented one, where 3,000 years of getting it wrong had produced something more pleasing than the truth. If accuracy could be ugly, then realism wasn't the destination art had always assumed it was. It was just one option, with costs. The horse didn't only correct a mistake, it quietly cracked the faith that had driven realistic painting for 5 centuries. The faith that truth and beauty were heading to the same place. The effect on art was immediate and permanent. Muybridge toured his photographs around the world, published them, projected them in motion on a device he built called the zoopraxiscope, effectively the first movie projector, spinning the frames fast enough to make the horse gallop again, correctly, in front of an audience. And the flying gallop, after 3,000 years, simply died. Within a decade, it had vanished from serious painting and from the horse racing magazines. Artists could no longer unknow what they'd seen. Some adapted fast. The French painter Meissonier, famous for his horses, is said to have reworked a painting after seeing Muybridge's images. Edgar Degas, himself a rider and one of the most acute observers of movement who ever painted, began giving his racehorses the gathered, individual, phase-correct legs that the photographs revealed, and he's often credited with some of the first genuinely accurate gallops in the history of art. A whole tradition of getting it wrong ended, and a new one began, built not on what the eye could see, but on what the camera had proved. Muybridge didn't stop at the horse either. Backed by the University of Pennsylvania, and encouraged by the painter Thomas Eakins, he went on to photograph everything in motion. Hundreds of studies of humans and animals, walking, running, jumping, climbing stairs, throwing, boxing, all frozen frame by frame. He published them in vast volumes that became a reference library of movement for artists everywhere. For the first time, a painter who wanted to know what anybody actually did in motion, a person breaking into a run, a bird taking off, a cat landing, could simply look it up. The guesswork that had governed the depiction of movement since the first cave painting was, in a single decade, replaced by evidence. That is a genuinely staggering shift, and it happened almost overnight. But not everyone was grateful. Some artists hated it. They felt the photographs had stolen something. That the awkward, frozen, technically correct horse had killed the beautiful, flowing, felt true horse, and that a painting isn't a scientific diagram, it's an impression of an experience. When you watch a horse gallop, you don't see the ugly frozen frames, you see grace and speed. Wasn't the flying gallop, they argued, actually more honest to the experience of watching a horse than the camera's cold dissection of it? It's a genuinely good question, and it never fully went away. The great sculptor Auguste Rodin made exactly this argument, and he made it beautifully. He said that it is the artist who tells the truth and the photograph that lies, because in reality time is not suspended, and if a sculptor shows a figure caught in a single frozen instant, the way a camera does, the figure looks paralyzed, dead, arrested. Whereas a painter or sculptor can show one part of a movement beginning while another part is already ending, compressing the whole flow of an action into a single image, something that never happens in any real instant and is therefore, technically, a lie, but which conveys the truth of motion far better than any frozen frame. By that logic, the flying gallop wasn't an error at all. It was an artist's compression of the entire feeling of a gallop into one impossible, more honest than real pose. The camera shows you a moment that is true and looks dead. The painter shows you a moment that never existed and looks alive. Which one is the lie? There's no settling that argument, and you shouldn't want to. Both sides are right, which is exactly what makes it one of the richest questions in art. But the fact remains, after 1878, artists who wanted the horse's legs to be literally correct finally could get them correct for the first time in human history. And most, eventually, did. Because once the truth is available, going on painting the old lie starts to feel like ignorance rather than art. The beautiful, impossible horse didn't vanish because it was ugly. It vanished because it was no longer innocent. You could no longer paint it without knowing you were painting something false. So, every painter got horses wrong until photography proved it. What does that really tell us? First, something humbling about the human eye. For 3,000 years, the greatest artists on earth, people whose entire genius was looking, who could paint the individual hairs on a dog and the light inside human skin, could not see what a horse's legs were doing. Their eyes were the bottleneck, not their skill. All that talent, all that observation, defeated by a few hundredths of a second. It's a reminder that we don't see reality directly. We see what our hardware can catch, and our hardware has limits we can't feel from the inside. The painters didn't know they were guessing. They thought they were seeing. And that should genuinely unsettle you a little, because it raises a question you can't fully answer. If the entire human race could be wrong, confidently and unanimously, for 3,000 years, about something as ordinary and visible as a running horse, something millions of people watched every single day, then what else are we all seeing wrong right now, together, without any idea that we are? The horse's legs were hiding in plain sight the whole time. The truth was right there in front of everyone, and no eye could catch it until a machine was built that could. There was no way to know, from the inside, that anything was being missed. The flying gallop didn't feel like a guess. It felt like a fact. That's the disturbing part. The limits of your perception don't announce themselves as limits. They feel exactly like reality. Every age is certain it sees clearly, and every age is partly a room full of people all making the same confident mistake, waiting for a machine that hasn't been invented yet to show them the horse's legs. Second, something about what machines did to art. The camera didn't just give artists a new tool. It gave them access to a layer of reality their own senses had never been able to reach. Time, sliced thinner than perception. And once the machine could see what the eye couldn't, the entire job of the artist quietly changed. If a camera can capture appearance more accurately than any hand, then accurate appearance stops being the point of painting. It's almost certainly not a coincidence that within a few decades of Muybridge freezing that horse, painters walked away from realism altogether, into impressionism, then abstraction. The camera won the contest for accuracy, so art went looking for everything accuracy can't do. The frozen horse is a small hinge on which a huge door swings, and there's a beautiful piece of defiance in the tale of this story. Even after the truth was known, some artists deliberately went back to painting horses wrong, on purpose, knowingly, as a choice. The surrealist René Magritte, decades after Muybridge, painted a racing horse in poses that don't match reality at all, in a picture called The Lost Jockey, precisely because he wasn't interested in the science of the gallop. He was after dream, memory, the idea of a horse racing across an imagined landscape. Once the camera had claimed accuracy, the deliberate error became available again as art. Not as ignorance this time, but as intention, which loops all the way back. The horse started as an honest guess, became a proven lie, wrong by necessity, then right by machine, then wrong again by choice. Here's what you can do now, forever. The next time you see an old painting of a galloping horse, on a wall, a coin, a monument, a Chinese scroll, a merry-go-round, look at its legs. If they're stretched out fore and aft, belly to the ground, flying like a greyhound, you're looking at the most persistent mistake in the history of art. A 3,000-year-old guess about emotion no human eye could ever catch, made by geniuses, repeated across every civilization, and finally undone by a murderer with a row of cameras and a rich man who wanted to win an argument. And you'll be seeing something those painters never could, the wrongness itself made visible, because you happen to live on the far side of the one afternoon that changed it. And there's one last thing worth sitting with. The flying gallop was wrong, but it wasn't stupid, and it may not even have been a failure. It was the honest record of how a galloping horse looks to a human being, fast, stretched, thrilling, a blur that the mind resolves into a reaching leap. The camera gave us the truth of the horse. The painters, for 3,000 years, gave us the truth of watching the horse. Both are real. The machine just proved they were never the same thing. And that, for most of human history, art had been quietly, beautifully painting. The horse was never really the subject. We were.